Think about one of your deepest convictions, something you believe so firmly you rarely even question it. Maybe it's a political view, a religious belief, a core assumption about human nature, or a belief about your own abilities. Now ask yourself, when did you actually examine the evidence for that conviction? When did you sit down and weigh the arguments dispassionately, like a scientist reviewing data? If you're honest, the answer is probably, almost never. And William James would tell you that's not a flaw in your thinking. It's how belief actually works. James was one of the first psychologists to take seriously the question of how human beings form convictions, not how they should form them in some ideal rational world, but how they actually do it, in the messy reality of lived experience. His 1897 essay, The Will to Believe, and his deeper psychological analysis in the Principles of Psychology, gave us a picture of belief that was radical for its time and remains deeply relevant today. The first thing James established was that most of our beliefs are not formed through conscious deliberation. They arise from a complex mixture of temperament, early experience, social environment, and emotional state. The rationalist tradition, from Descartes onward, imagined belief as something like a judicial proceeding: evidence presented, arguments weighed, verdict delivered. James said this describes almost no actual case of human belief. Instead, we tend to believe first and reason second. We hold a conviction with emotional commitment, and then we use our intelligence to justify and defend it. This is not James being cynical about human reason. He himself was a brilliant, careful thinker who valued intellectual honesty enormously. But he was also honest enough to see that the will, the emotions, and the social self are always present in the act of believing, shaping what evidence we seek, what arguments we find persuasive, and what conclusions we are willing to accept. His most controversial contribution was the doctrine he called the will to believe. James argued that in certain circumstances, when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, when the question matters deeply to us, and when we must act one way or another regardless, we have the right, even the duty, to choose to believe based on our hopes and values. A man dangling from a cliff who believes he can make the leap will try harder and succeed more often than one paralyzed by doubt. The belief in the possibility becomes part of the evidence for its truth. James was careful to limit this doctrine. He was not saying you can believe whatever you find comfortable. He was addressing what he called genuine options, choices between beliefs that are live, actually possible for you, forced, you must take some position, and momentous, the stakes are high. In these rare but crucial situations, refusing to commit is itself a choice, and often a worse one than committing with insufficient evidence. The modern concept of self-fulfilling prophecy is essentially a version of James's insight. When teachers believe their students are capable, those students perform better. When patients believe a treatment will work, outcomes improve. When you believe a relationship can survive a difficult period, you invest the effort that actually saves it. Belief does not passively reflect reality, it actively helps create it. James was equally interested in the role of emotion in conviction. He noticed that beliefs which seem purely intellectual are almost always anchored to an emotional state. The person who believes the universe is fundamentally ordered and purposeful doesn't just hold a philosophical position, they feel something when they hold it. A sense of safety, meaning, belonging. Strip away that emotional resonance, and the intellectual structure often collapses. This is why purely rational arguments so rarely changes deep convictions. You can demolish the arguments and the conviction remains, because it was never really about the arguments. Social belonging also plays an enormous role. James identified. We tend to believe what the communities we belong to believe. Not merely because we've been persuaded, but because belief is partly a form of loyalty. To abandon a conviction your community holds is to risk your standing, your relationships, your identity. The psychic cost of intellectual dissent is often enormous. This is not weakness, it's an acknowledgement of how deeply social our nature is. So what does James's psychology of belief suggest we should do? First, it suggests humility. Your deepest convictions were not arrived at through pure reason, and neither were anyone else's. They emerged from a rich mixture of experience, emotion, community, and temperament. That doesn't make them wrong, but it does make them worth examining. Second, it suggests paying attention to where your beliefs lead. Do they open possibilities or close them? Do they generate courage and energy or despair and paralysis? The pragmatic test of belief is always, what does this conviction do in your life? Third, James would encourage us to recognize that in genuine uncertainty, the choice to believe in possibility is not a cognitive error. It's sometimes the most intelligent and life-affirming response we can make. Belief, for James, was not the enemy of good thinking. Rigid, unexamined belief was. But the capacity to commit, to hold a conviction with courage and test it in lived experience, that was not something to be ashamed of. It was, in his view, essential to being fully human. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James for more insights from the father of American psychology. New videos every week.